Rachel Maddow show, starting with the one and only Rachel Maddow, begins now. Good evening, Rachel.
Good evening, Chris. How's your Friday going?
It's good. It's not quite as eventful as yours has been, but it's been good.
Thank you very much. Giving it away, as always. Thank you, my friend. Thanks to you at home for joining us this hour. I will tell you what Chris is referring to is that a couple of hours ago, maybe even less than that, I was standing knee-deep in a trout stream in Tennessee. But now it's Mueller time. And so I'm in a studio in the great state of Tennessee. The trout are basically just as safe as they were when I was flailing away at them ineffectually this afternoon. But now it is, listen, this is history. This is a reason to stop fishing and go to work. Our job tonight, as a country, sort of, or at least what everybody in the country is going to be doing tonight, is trying to figure out what it means that the report of Special Counsel Robert Mueller has finally been submitted. We've heard it said so many times that it was imminent, that it was done. Maybe it was already done and we didn't know about it. Finally, it's happened. In terms of what that means and what Mueller found, we know only the smallest little bits. This is the start of something, apparently, not the end of something. I mean, the logistics of today, at least, we know a little bit about. At 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time, the staff of the House Judiciary Committee got a call from the Justice Department that somebody would be bringing a letter from the Attorney General. I'm sure they all immediately guessed what that letter was. A Justice Department staffer or messenger of some kind, all we know is that she was wearing a North Face jacket. She brought, in fact, 2 letters to the committee in 2 separate manila envelopes. That was just before 5 o'clock Eastern Time. Our assumption is that there were 2 envelopes and 2 separate letters because that was one letter for the Democratic chairman of the committee and one for the Republican ranking member of the committee. The chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Democratic Congressman Jerry Nadler, was at his New York office. He was not in D.C., so the committee staff quickly made a digital copy and got the letter to him that way. We know those details thanks to a Judiciary Committee spokesperson laying out that process. We know that is how the House Judiciary Committee was notified this evening that Special Counsel Robert Mueller had completed his investigation. We are assuming that a similar process, or at least a process with the same effect, also unfolded at the Senate Judiciary Committee around the same time today, but we don't have the same kind of readout about that process. And so we know the logistics of how we got the notification that it ended. And obviously right now we have mostly just a ton of questions as to what Mueller's report says, how complete it is, who gets to see it, who gets to decide who gets to see it, and when. But after 2 years of almost entirely just questions about what Mueller is doing, I mean, some answers will start to emerge now. We get actually quite a bit from the letter that Attorney General Bill Barr did send to the chairs of those committees, to Democratic Congressman Jerry Nadler in the House and Republican Senator Lindsey Graham in the Senate. Those are the two judiciary chairs. The letter was also addressed to the ranking members, to Doug Collins, who's the top Republican on the committee in the House, and Dianne Feinstein, who's the top Democrat on the committee in the Senate. So it's addressed to those 4 people. The letter is just 1 page, and it does actually give us kind of a lot. Here's how it starts. Quote, "Dear Chairman Graham, Chairman Nadler, Ranking Member Feinstein, and Ranking Member Collins, I write to notify you, pursuant to the Special Counsel regulations, that Special Counsel Robert S. Mueller III has concluded his investigation of Russian interference in the 2016 election and related matters." Under the Special Counsel regulations, the Attorney General is required to notify these specific people. The regulations spell out that the Attorney General has to notify the chair and ranking members of the Judiciary Committees in the House and the Senate. And those are the people who need to be notified, and they need to be notified of 3 things. Number 1, the appointment of the special counsel. That happened back in 2017. The removal of a special counsel. That never happened. And number 3, the conclusion of a special counsel's investigation. So this is Bill Barr telling Congress, as he is required to do, okay, here's the 3rd thing. The investigation is complete. That's the part of this special counsel experience that has happened on my watch. I am notifying you. He then says, quote, "In addition to this notification, the special counsel regulations also require that I provide you with, quote, a description and explanation of instances, if any, in which the Attorney General or acting Attorney General concluded that a proposed action by a special counsel was so inappropriate or unwarranted under established departmental practices that it should not be pursued. There were no such instances during the special counsel's investigation. So this alone is really important. This is a big deal, right? This has been the subject of lots and lots of speculation and lots of fighting, honestly. But this is the Attorney General informing Congress, right? The Attorney General has to inform Congress if there was anything the special counsel wanted to do that the Attorney General blocked him from doing. There had been worries and speculation that the confirmation of Bill Barr as Attorney General, he was nominated and confirmed in the middle of the special counsel's investigation. He was nominated and confirmed after he had volunteered a big, long, sharply worded memorandum to the Trump White House that criticized the special counsel because of the circumstances under which Bill Barr was brought on, right? His predecessor, Jeff Sessions, was fired as Attorney General. The president said openly because Sessions recused himself from overseeing the Mueller investigation. Well, here comes Bill Barr, who has volunteered to the White House when he was in private practice. Hey, I've got tons of criticism of the special counsel, and I think he's doing tons of things wrong. Then Bill Barr gets nominated and confirmed as AG. So there'd been all these worries and speculation that the reason Bill Barr got that job, the reason he was seen by President Trump as a suitable replacement for Jeff Sessions, and therefore what might be expected of Bill Barr in that job, is that once he got confirmed as Attorney General, he'd stick his foot out and trip the special counsel, right? He would use his power as Attorney General to block Mueller from something that Mueller was otherwise going to do, something that Mueller was otherwise going to pursue. Barr was going to block him. Well, at least as far as this letter goes, from the Attorney General, Bill Barr, tonight, Barr says he never exercised that power. He's notifying Congress formally there was never anything the special counsel sought to do that Bill Barr stopped Mueller from doing. And that's fascinating. Of course, everybody would like to hear that from Robert Mueller as well as from Bill Barr, but at this point, it's only Bill Barr who is speaking on Mueller's behalf. Robert Mueller is still, at this point, publicly silent, as he has been from the very beginning, although we'll have more on that in a moment. Here's more from the letter, though. Quote, the special counsel has submitted to me today a, quote, confidential report explaining the prosecution or declination decisions he has reached as required by the regulations. Quote, I am reviewing the report and anticipate that I may be in a position to advise you of the special counsel's principal conclusions as soon as this weekend. So this is the Attorney General telling us that he has Mueller's report and he is not handing the report over to Congress. Right? This letter from Bill Barr is not a cover letter with Mueller's findings attached. But he says he plans to give them, I guess, bullet points, something this weekend. He says he will advise them, he will advise the chairs and the ranking members of the judiciary committees of the special counsel's principal conclusions. I mean, I should qualify. I am presuming that when he says he can advise them this as soon as this weekend of the special counsel's principal conclusions, I am presuming that means he's planning on advising specifically the people to whom this letter is addressed. Just the top Democrats and top Republicans on the judiciary committees in the House and the Senate. Now, once they are advised by Bill Barr as soon as this weekend of the principal conclusions of Robert Mueller's report, will those chairs and ranking members of the judiciary committees then tell the public what Bill Barr has told them? And what counts as Mueller's principal conclusions anyway? How much detail is that? I mean, how much is the Attorney General going to tell those two House members and those two senators as soon as this weekend? We do not know, not yet. But then here's the last substantive part of the letter, and I think it's probably the most important part of the letter, while also being the most frustratingly vague. Again, this is Bill Barr's letter. Quote, separately, I intend to consult with Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein and Special Counsel Robert Mueller to determine what other information from the report can be released to Congress and the public consistent with the law, including the special counsel regulations and the department's longstanding practices and policies. Quote, I remain committed to as much transparency as possible and will keep you informed as to the status of my review. Sincerely, William P. Barr, Attorney General. So, a couple of important things here. Number one, obviously, Barr is saying explicitly, I did not block Robert Mueller from doing anything that he wanted to do. There wasn't anything that he was trying to pursue where I said, no, as Attorney General, I'm stepping in and blocking you from doing that. Interesting. Again, I would like to know more about that, but that's the blunt assertion tonight from Attorney General William Barr. Also, Barr is going to, maybe as soon as this weekend, brief Mueller's principal conclusions to the leadership of the judiciary committees. We don't know what principal conclusions are. We don't know for sure that it's going to be this weekend, and we don't know how constrained the leadership of those committees will be from sharing that with other people, including us, the public. But three, separate and apart from that, Barr is thinking about what beyond those principal conclusions can go to the Congress and to the public. And you get the sense from the way he wrote this that he thinks of that as one consideration, not two, right? You get the sense the way he wrote this that he thinks anything that goes to Congress will almost instantly end up given to the public because members of Congress, at least one member of Congress, will decide to leak it or release it properly. But he's thinking about that now. He's thinking about what Congress can see. He's thinking about what the public can see. He says he is consulting on that matter with Mueller himself and with Rod Rosenstein, who is still there as Deputy Attorney General. Remember, Rod Rosenstein appointed Robert Mueller in the first place, and Rod Rosenstein has reportedly been Mueller's principal supervisor / overseer for the entire 22-month duration of the special counsel's tenure. Now, the decision about releasing stuff to Congress and releasing stuff to the public, Barr says that will be consistent with the law, consistent with the regulations governing the special counsel, and consistent with longstanding practices and policies of the Justice Department. What does that mean? I mean, we've never had a special counsel. I mean, we've had special prosecutors in the past, right? We've had other kinds of people convened to do this type of work. But under the special counsel regulations, we've never had this type of report at this type of stage. We don't know what longstanding practices and policies of the Justice Department are when it comes to sharing with Congress and the public the findings of a special counsel. There isn't anything longstanding because they've never really dealt with this before. But when Barr says he's going to decide what can go to the rest of Congress and what can go to the public, consistent with the law, consistent with the special counsel regulations, and consistent with Justice Department policies and practices, that's the part that is going to determine whether we figure this thing out as a country, whether we, the country, are ever fully told what Robert Mueller really figured out about Russia messing with our election to try to elect Donald Trump president, and whether Trump and his campaign were in on that. Right? There has never before been a president, there's never been not since the 1700s has there been a high-ranking government official who was investigated for potentially being in the thrall of a foreign power. It's certainly never happened to a president. Are we going to find out what Robert Mueller found out when he investigated that core issue? Well, it depends on what William Barr thinks about longstanding practices and policies in the Justice Department and how those can be applied to this question. But I think it's also worth noting that Bill Barr also says there is some other information in the Mueller report. Remember, all that the special counsel regulations require is that Mueller provide the Attorney General with a confidential report explaining the prosecution or declination decisions reached by the special counsel. So in theory, that could have meant that Mueller's final report would be as bare bones as, I prosecuted this list of people. Here are all the indictments that I brought because there was enough evidence to prosecute them. I did not prosecute anybody else because there was not enough evidence to prosecute anybody else. I mean, he could have just done that, one sentence and a list of all the indictments he filed. Boom, done. A lot of people thought that is what Mueller would do in terms of filing his final report. I mean, if he had done that, the bullet points briefing that Bill Barr says he'll provide to Congress as soon as this weekend, that would more or less be the whole report. He said he prosecuted these people. That's it. Apparently, Mueller didn't do something that bare bones. The report is apparently more comprehensive than just that sort of de minimis list. And now the Attorney General is saying he's reviewing it. He needs to go through it to figure out first of all, to figure out how and when he can release the principal conclusions. And then beyond that, what further can be released and what cannot. So, I mean, just the fact that information exists to be decided upon, that is something we now know about the Mueller report tonight that we didn't know before he turned it in. Attorney General Barr saying in his letter that he's committed to as much transparency as possible. Again, that is a subjective thing, but he says he'll try. On that point, for what it's worth, I'll note that Bill Barr has actually already made his first decision on transparency with the Mueller report with this letter tonight. The special counsel regulations require that the Attorney General make this notification to the Judiciary Committee, to the chairs and ranking members of the Judiciary Committees. The Attorney General was not required to release this letter publicly. That's a choice left up to him by the regulations, but he writes in this letter to the Judiciary Committee chairs and ranking members tonight, quote, the special counsel regulations provide that the Attorney General may determine that public release of this notification would be in the public interest. I have so determined. He says, I will disclose this letter to the public after delivering it to you. So that was Bill Barr's first judgment call on whether to make something public. He decided, yes, he would make it public. But it's early days yet, early hours even. I should tell you that multiple news outlets, including NBC News, are reporting tonight that, according to senior Justice Department officials, there will be no further Mueller indictments. We don't know if there are any sealed indictments in other jurisdictions. There's no indication that there are. There's also no indication one way or the other about whether other Justice Department prosecutors, for instance, U.S. attorneys' offices like the Southern District of New York or the Eastern District of Virginia or anybody else. We don't know if any U.S. attorneys' offices or any other prosecutors in Main Justice might bring further indictments based on material the special counsel's office has passed on to them. But NBC reports that no new indictments will come from Mueller's team itself, which makes sense that we've started to see the Mueller team essentially start to disband and those prosecutors take other gigs elsewhere in the government or even outside of government. I'll also tell you that although this notification means the special counsel investigation, the special counsel's office is closing its part of the investigation, according to the Justice Department, Robert Mueller, for now, remains the special counsel. He's not gone. He and a small staff are remaining in place to close up the office and handle any dangling threads. I mean, they've been there almost 2 years. Somebody's got to tidy that place up, right? One watchdog group tonight has announced already that they have already filed Freedom of Information Act requests to obtain the full version of Mueller's report. The chairman of the Intelligence Committee in the House, Democratic Congressman Adam Schiff, says tonight that, and this is an interesting curveball tonight. He's saying, separate and apart from any findings from the special counsel that pertain to the criminal law, he's saying if there are counterintelligence findings from Mueller's investigation, counterintelligence findings about, say, foreign intelligence operations, targeting or compromising U.S. persons in national politics and government. Those counterintelligence findings, by law, according to Adam Schiff, must be briefed to the intelligence committees in the House, even if Barr doesn't want to release the rest of the stuff to the rest of the Congress. Here's the statement tonight from Adam Schiff. Quote, today, the Attorney General has informed Congress and the public that the special counsel has concluded his investigation and submitted a report of his findings. That report needs to be released to the public. Quote, pursuant to the special counsel regulations, Mueller's report is likely to focus on his prosecutorial decisions and may not shed necessary light on counterintelligence findings of profound significance to our committee and the nation, whether the president or others around him have been compromised by a foreign power. The Mueller investigation, like our own probe, began as a counterintelligence inquiry into whether individuals associated with the Trump campaign were compromised by a hostile foreign nation. By law, the evidence Mueller has uncovered on all counterintelligence matters must now be shared with the House Intelligence Committee, whether it resulted in indictment or not. This is him saying, Barr, you do not have that much leeway when it comes to deciding what to disclose to Congress here. Any intelligence matters must be disclosed to us. Quote, we will insist that the Justice Department meet its statutory obligations and be transparent with our committee and the public. Anything less would be negligent in the service of our national security. So that's the Intelligence Committee chairman saying, hey, I hear you, Mr. Attorney General, when you say you are deciding what information in the report can be released to Congress. But any counterintelligence investigation into the report must by law be released to the Intelligence Committee. which is, again, not at all the way that Attorney General William Barr is talking about what he's going to do with this information. But the Intelligence Committee chairman may have a point there in terms of them having the law on their side for being able to access this information, sort of despite Attorney General William Barr's discretion. And now tonight, there's this statement from Chairman Jerry Nadler, the Democratic chairman of Judiciary in the House.
The important thing to say now is that the Mueller report, which was handed to the Attorney General, must be made public in its entirety. The American people deserve to know what was going on and the evidence against people or lack of evidence against people. And we are going to insist that the Attorney General make public the entire report and give to the relevant committees the underlying evidence. The precedents are there to do this. 880,000 pages of evidence, of internal evidence from the FBI was given by the Justice Department just last year to the Judiciary Committee when the Judiciary Committee was run by Republicans. So they've set the precedent. If the Justice Department doesn't release the whole report or tries to keep parts of it secret, we will certainly subpoena the parts of the report, and we will reserve the right to call Mueller or to testify before the committee or to subpoena him, as several other committees might do. But we'll only do that if necessary, obviously. The important thing is that the entire report be made public and the evidence behind it be given to the relevant committees so the American people can be informed.
Tonight is a landmark moment. I would still be fishing otherwise. But we still have no idea as to what Robert Mueller has found. You heard the chairman of the Judiciary Committee there talking about the need to disclose this information and plans to get it. We don't know what Robert Mueller found out in his investigation. And honestly, we don't know how his investigation proceeded and whether it was impeded by any sort of pressure or interference by anyone at any time. Now the fight to find out all of that stuff starts in earnest. And this is truly uncharted territory. We've never had a special counsel reporting to Congress in the way that reporting to the Attorney General, who's then reporting to Congress in the way that has just started tonight with this report from Robert Mueller. We don't have precedent as a country to see how this is going to go. And a long way toward the way this is going to be figured out is going to be based on the integrity of the leaders involved here, the public servants involved here, and on the clamor and pressure from the public that this stuff should become known.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.